Back to another video. So as a follow-up to my previous video where I talked about kind of how to climb in League and some of the most important things, I wanted to make a video talking about why League is so hard to learn compared to other games. So I'll tell you guys a little bit of my experience with other games. So obviously I've played League to a very high level. Like I've played League for a bit over 10 years now. I was a pro player for 4.5 years, and my rank that I'm most proud of is being rank 84 on the Korean server with 1353 LP. So obviously got a ton of experience with League, but I have played some other games as well. So I've been 4300 MMR, which is like low master in StarCraft 2. That's about D1 equivalent, I think, in League. Yeah, about the same as that. Then I've also been Master in Apex in a couple of the hard seasons. I've been Grandmaster in the Voltaic benchmarks in Season 4. And finally, I've done quite a bit of Mythic rating on WoW. So that's about my experience with other games. I'm not going to pretend like I know everything about every game. But I just kind of want to put that out there to help contextualize some of this video when I'm talking about some of the things that I think make League uniquely hard when compared to some of the other games. So there's some things about League that are kind of obvious that make it difficult, right? Like there's tons of champions, right? I think we're on like 170 or something. That means there's hundreds of abilities, there's tons of items, effects, passive, you know, there's this huge amount of knowledge that you just kind of need to know, right? Like, obviously, some of it's more important than others, but a lot of this is kind of just memorization, right? Or stuff that you're probably just going to pick up by playing the game for a time. And obviously, like, League is not unique when it comes to that, but it's definitely one of the things that's going to add up. And you'll kind of see that as we go through this video, that a lot of the stuff, I think, League just happens to have, you know, like a combination of a whole bunch of things that is making it really hard. So the new player experience in League is pretty tough. I'm sure you guys are kind of aware of that. Like, especially now that the game has been out for so long, I think it's really hard to get into if you don't have a, you know, a friend or whatever. But like I said, that's kind of all the stuff that I think is fairly obvious. And in this video, I mostly want to talk about some of the things I think are less obvious. You know, some of the things that I have found, like from coaching people, tend to have like a pretty major impact, but again, like don't, you know, kind of make themselves like readily visible, I suppose. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and it's going to be a major part of this video, and I talked about it a little bit in the last one, is delayed consequences. So League is a game that leans like very, very heavily on delayed consequences. And like I said, League is, you know, by no means the only game that has this, right? Like, delayed consequences, actually, I'll explain what that means first. Basically, it means, like, if you make a mistake at some point in the game, it affects, like, other parts of the game. So an example could be in League, like, if you die in your laning phase or whatever, like, that's going to affect later team fights and stuff down the line. And you might be saying, again, like, League is not unique in that, and that's, like, definitely true, right? Like, if you think of some of the other games that I've used as an example, like, if you think of something like StarCraft, right? Like, if you kill the enemy workers in the early game or whatever, right? Like, there is going to be a pretty sizable... Does that guy die? Oh my god, I survived. There's going to be a pretty sizable effect there, right? Like, he is going to have his economy, like, impacted for a long time in the rest of the game. And you might think, okay, like, a game, some sort of, like, FPS maybe, right? If you think of, like, Apex as the example. If you have a really solid early game, right? Like, you win a fight off drop really well, very cleanly, that can easily snowball into more, you know, I guess you call them, like, skirmish wins or fight wins later down the line. So this is the case for every game with any form of snowball, right? I do think League, though, is a bit more punishing than a lot of these other games. So one of the reasons for that is, like, the game time is just long, right? Like, League does have one of the longer game times when compared to some of these other things. So, like, if you make a mistake early, it's going to impact the game for a long time. And I think the other thing is that, like, a lot of these delayed consequences they're really hard to see. So the example I like to give is that video where I coached ATRQ, who's an Iron 4 player. And I'll link the video in the description in case, like, any of you are interested in it. But in this video, like, he was playing, like, pretty well. You know, he was playing a Kali, he was having a super solid game, I think it was, like, 5-1 or something, and the enemy team had picked up 2 dragons early. So what that means is, like, you know, 3rd dragon is going to really put a timer on the game, because if they lose 3rd dragon, there's a good chance that they then lose soul, and it makes the game really difficult. Oh, that's not good. And that's, like, basically what happened. So, like, you know, HRQ he was pushing the side lane, and then around 30 seconds before Dragon, he was, like, a little too far up. He lost his Akali ult, and then as a result, like, he didn't have a Akali ult for 3rd Dragon. And because he didn't have a Akali ult for 3rd Dragon, it meant that he was just, like, slightly too weak to actually contest. Oh my god, unlucky. He was slightly too weak to actually contest, so they lost 3rd Dragon. And then Later on in that game, so about 6 minutes later, right, HRQ's team had managed to win a team fight, and then straight after they did the dragon, and it got stolen, and suddenly the enemy team had soul, and as a result, like, they lost the game. So that's a really good example of something that, you know, happens, like, a very, very long time ago, right? Like, that was something where he made a mistake, a small mistake, roughly, you know, 6 minutes before the actual punishment. Of ending up losing soul, and it was kind of like a long sequence of things, right? It's like he lost his ulti by being like a bit too far pushed up because he wasn't like aware enough of his team or whatever. And those kind of like long chains, I guess, of mistakes and like lacking a clear feedback loop, I think makes this game quite hard to learn. So yeah, it's very easy to kind of get lost and you know, not know like the real problem behind something. And actually, that's something I see when coaching all the time, is I'll ask them, you know, like, what do you think happened here? And it might be something like, oh, I just, like, played too aggro, or whatever, you know, it might be something like that. And, you know, like, that is not completely untrue, right? Like, in some of those situations, that is true. But also, it can be, like, a ton of other things. It could be, for example, that you missed your ward timing previously, or it could be that you overplayed before, and that caused you to lose flash, and then, as a result, like, you're getting camped because you have no flash, right? Do you see what I mean? So there's a lot of these, like, long chains of sequences that can lead to consequences down the line. And an extra thing that I think is particularly common in League nowadays that kind of like leads to this like being even more extreme is that you can, depending on the time of game, you can make the same mistake and it can like not be that bad. Whereas like there are times where you make a mistake and it's like immediately game losing. So like, yeah, again, to make this super obvious, like if you you know, die, say 30 seconds before Baron, right? Like, pretty obvious that's gonna be bad, right? Because, like, if you die 30 seconds before Baron, and you lose Baron, like, it's gonna make the game really hard. At the same time, though, like, if you die in the exact same way, right? You make the exact same mistake, but, like, Baron's down. Like, let's say you died at 23:30 instead of 24:30. If you have, like, no Dark Seal stacks, you have no Bounty stacks, or whatever, like, that might not actually mean anything. And so, like, I think that can also make things kind of difficult because, you know, sometimes you get this, like, massive slap in the face of, like, holy shit, like, you're not allowed to do that. And sometimes you, like, virtually don't get punished for it at all. So, like I said, that kind of, like, muddied waters feedback loop is making life really, really difficult. Now, the follow-up to that I want to talk about for a bit is the fact that, like, League is a team game, right? So, like, we've talked a lot about, like, the delayed consequences and stuff, but one of the difficulties I think about League is that your delayed consequences are not the only consequences that matter. So, like, I'll give you an example of something that kind of happened in the League community, like, a little while ago. So there was this, like, big discussion on Twitter about Sona. And basically the two sides were like, some people think Sona is complete dog shit, you know, like Sona is a champ that is like very weak early and like makes your AD carries game really hard. It makes your mid laner's job quite hard as well. But on the other hand, like Sona scales insanely well. And like, you know, around 25 minutes or so, if the game isn't over, Sona is, she's really, really impactful. She's going to be exceptionally strong. And, I am in the camp that, like, Sona is kind of like a more situational pick. Like, I think Sona is really, really good to pick when the enemy team doesn't really have the tools to punish you. Like, if the enemy team blind picks something, like, kind of non-threatening, like, let's say, Milio, like, you know, there are not the tools available to punish the Sona. So the Sona just gets the scale for free, and it kind of goes insane. But, you know, from, like, a delayed consequences point of view, if we say that, like, Sona is a champ that needs to be, like, counterpicked, right? Or needs to be picked in good situations. Like, what happens if you play a scenario... Wait, is this guy just dead? Oh, he just ulted straight away. There can be a scenario where someone else's delayed consequence, like, affects you and a bunch of other people in a big way. So... Again, I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you're playing Champs like, and your support first picks Sona, right? And it's like, okay, like, there's a reason you're not really allowed to do that, and that's because, like, in theory, your teammates should get punished. So what's going to happen in that situation is, like, the enemy team counterpicks Sona. And then what that probably means is, like, their bot lane has Prior, and then, like, as a result of their bot lane having Prior, they can then gank your mid laner, so your mid laner is forced to play safe. And then as your mid laner is forced to play safe, you know, that means the enemy mid gets Prior. Holy shit. Is that even good? Your mid laner is forced to give Prior, and then, like, as a result of giving the Prior, the bot lane then gets died, right? And the Sona gets punished even harder. So in that situation, it's like the mid laner primarily is the one that suffers from that, right? Like, your Sona picked, you know, in kind of a bad situation, and, you know, now your mid laner is able to go bot and get, like, free kills and stuff, which makes life really, really difficult. And... you could say to that, okay, well, like, if you see someone, like, first pick Sona on your team as a mid laner, you can kind of be like, okay, like, you're gonna have to know that you need to play something a little safer because, you know, like, you're going to get ganked a lot by the enemy team, and that's, like, not something that's... that is not something that is going to happen to them, right? Because you have the Sona. But the issue with that is that, well, you know, sometimes it would be nice to pick something safe, but you might not have an option. Like, if I make this a little more complicated, let's say the enemy mid blind picks something really greedy. This could be something like a Cassidy, but it could easily just be, like, some sort of first strike scaler. So, like, what you're trying to think is, like, you're like, okay, I want to punish. But it's pretty hard for you to punish because, again, you know that, like, your bot lane's not going to have prio, and then you're going to get punished the whole time. And that's not even considering the fact that, like, most people in this game probably can't functionally play more than, like, 3 or 4 champions, right? So having, you know, both the champ select knowledge and the, like, champion pool to actually, like, facilitate this Sona blind pick, it's going to require, like, a lot of skill, right? Or maybe rather a lot of experience on the champion. So that's a really good example of a delayed consequence from someone else impacting your game in a big way, and it's something that, like, you can't even control directly. Now, you might be thinking, again, like, okay, well, League is not the only game where, you know, delayed consequences are, delayed consequences for your teammates are something that exists. So a good example of another game that has that is something like Mythic Raiding in WoW. Like, it's very, very possible that, like, your teammate, or I guess your fellow raider, makes a mistake, and, like, that causes the entire raid to wipe or whatever. Like, that's not uncommon at all. Bro, I don't think you're allowed to walk through here. Okay? Wow, he's gonna try. That's fucking crazy. Yeah, like, one person can make a mistake on a boss, and, like, especially on, you know, like, Mythic end bosses, like, that can cause your whole raid to wipe. But there's a really, really big difference for a game like that compared to League, and the difference is pretty fundamentally just that you have access to voice chat. You know, like, League, I would say in League, the only real competitive queue is solo queue. You know, like, even though flex queue is an option, like, we have to kind of be realistic here and say that, like, flex queue is not really, like, a competitive queue. At least in my opinion. And I think that's, like, a widely accepted opinion. I think there's a variety of reasons for that. Like, maybe it's that it came out way later than solo queue. You know, like, maybe if flex queue had been in the game to begin with, like, maybe it would have been a competitive option. But at least these days, like, flex queue, a lot of the time people are very high rank in flex queue and much, much lower ranked in solo queue. There's a couple other things, like, it's very controlled by boosters, right? Like, there's a lot of win trading and boosting and stuff that goes on in flex queue. The population playing it is, like, smaller and stuff, so there's, like, a whole variety of reasons for flex queue not to be competitive. So what that means is that for the majority of the League player base, right, obviously there's, like, professional play, but that's not something that, you know, like, very many players are going to get to experience. But the majority of the League player base, the, like, highest, I guess, like, highest form of competitive queue available to them is solo queue, a queue that has, like, no voice communications and no real way for, like, prior strategization. Because, like, if we come back to that Sona example, right, like, that's something where in competitive you could be willing to make that decision. You could be like, okay, well, you know, like, this might suck for my mid laner if I pick Sona here, but, like, if that's something, like, you kind of agree upon as a team and you're, like, ahead of time kind of aware that that's something you can deal with, then I think that's very different than if you just queue into it in solo queue. So what that means is that reaching the highest level in League of Legends requires a huge amount of, like, ability to adapt, because you need to be, like, super aware of, like, all these different factors and, like, you know, all the stuff that your teammates can do without it being communicated. And I've always thought that was kind of a shame. You know, like, maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but I always thought it was, like, very sad that the way, like, most people experience this game is through solo queue, because, like, competitive, you know, like, playing with people that are all on-rolled and, like, all there to win and, you know, on voice comms and stuff is a much better experience. Actually, funnily enough, when I was a pro player, I actually thought that, like, after I stopped playing League competitively, that I would never play solo queue again, because I just kind of didn't consider it as, like, real League of Legends. Like, it wasn't as fun, it wasn't as competitive, and, yeah, it just kind of was a meme, in my opinion. Now, yeah, I play a lot of solo queue these days, because, like, well, by and large, it's my job. I think that guy's dead. Nice. I think I'm going to lose this game, by the way, which is making me very sad. What was I saying? Yeah, so the solo queue being, you know, like, kind of a, I want to say, like, a single-player game disguised as a multiplayer game. You know what I mean? Like, it's very focused on your own individual performance because you have no way of, like, communicating and playing with your teammates. And in some ways, that makes solo queue, like, more competitive, right? Like, since you are the only constant in like the sea of shifting variables, I think the solo queue rankings, like by and large, are like pretty accurate. Obviously, there are things that can like influence it, you know, like just playing OP champs or whatever, and metas and stuff like that. But, you know, solo queue is a really good, really accurate representation of how skilled someone is. And I guess, like, quickly on that topic, just while I remember before I move to the next thing, a lot of people have asked me, like, would I want voice chat in League? And I think that, like, I'd honestly say, like, the pros are outweighed by the cons these days. Like, I think potentially if voice comms had been in the game from the very start, it might have been a good thing for the game, but I think now it's like so far along in League's life cycle that it probably isn't really worth it. I think that like the League community is kind of like toxic now, right? Like they've got that reputation built up and stuff, and it's almost like normalized to flame after a game, funnily enough. So like, I don't know. I think it would probably be a negative these days. So I don't really agree with a lot of people saying like just adding voice chat will fix all the problems. So yeah, to kind of TLDR everything I've talked about so far, I think that League has a unique combination of delayed consequences combined with like a very long game time in a team-based game, right? Like it's not a solo player game. And that, along with like this very hidden feedback loop, in my opinion, where like you're not immediately punished for the majority of your mistakes, makes the game like really, really difficult to learn. So that kind of brings me to the second part of the video, which is that, you know, if there are all these things that are making the game difficult to learn, like how do we go about learning it? Like what are the strategies and stuff we can use? So probably I would say like what the most important thing is kind of just like understanding like overall kind of like how the game works. I know it's like a very broad... Can I flash this guy? No. I know it's like a very broad statement, but what I mean, I guess, is like it's much harder to like rote learn League of Legends than some of the other games. You know, like I compare League to a game like StarCraft, where you can spend time like memorizing your build order and stuff, and memorizing like certain responses. And it's much more difficult to do that in League. Like while you could memorize every matchup one by one, it's probably a lot easier to do something like memorize the way you're going to play your range versus melee matchups, for example, right? Like, basically what I'm saying is that in League... How did that guy want me to? In League, you need to generalize quite a bit more, because there's just going to be so many different situations. And if you kind of understand, like, what the most important, you know, things in the game are, it's a bit easier to kind of, like, work stuff out. And a good example would be, like, you know, in my previous video, I emphasized the importance of, say, like, farming. I emphasized the importance of, like, objectives. And you can kind of use that to help, you know, again, work back to figuring out what to do. So, like, if you know, like, I guess, like, in a situation, if you're not sure what to do, but if you know, like, the objectives are important and you know the farm is important, you might be able to figure out, like, what the best thing to do is. Do I need a TP to this? I think I will, just in case. Probably didn't. So yeah, overall, like, learning the fundamentals is, like, very, very important. And you hear that, like, word thrown around a lot of, like, fundamentals. It's kind of a buzzword at this point. I think, you know, it's sometimes, like, people aren't even really sure what that means anymore. But what I would say for the fundamentals, I have a whole list of them. In fact, I will link that in the description below, my fundamental tier list. But things like, if you can learn things that'll happen every game, like, there's always a laning phase. There's pretty much always team fighting. You know, there will always be farming. There will always be champ mastery. You know, like, these sort of things, they're going to affect every single game. And that is, like, very, very important in League, is to learn and focus on things that do happen more or less every single game. You know, like, one thing I remember when I was learning this game is I'd go on, like, you know, I'd go on, like, forums, like, Reddit or whatever, and I would look at, like, the things, the advice, like, people would say and stuff. And don't get me wrong, like, there's a lot of good advice out there, but some of the advice is so specific, it's like, almost not important, you know what I mean? Obviously, like, to some extent, everything is important, right? But, like, when I... you know, when I would look at these things and it'd be like, okay, like, what do I do in a situation where I get Elder Dragon and my teammate dies or whatever? And it's like, you know, like, is that important? It's important in the same way that everything is important. But, like, how many games do you think that happens? You know, like, that probably happens in, I don't know, like, 1 out of, oh, I don't know, like, 20 games maybe? It might even be less or more. I'm not really sure, but the point is... That was so funny. The point is that it just does not happen very often, right? In comparison to, like, okay, if you need to figure out something like, what do I do when the enemy team has a ganking jungler and a ganking support, right? And then your answer might be like, okay, you just need to make sure you have like good wards down or whatever. It's probably a bit more specific than that, but do you get what I'm saying? Like, focusing on these things that are going to happen all the time is much more important than these like hyper-specific scenarios. And I guess like another kind of like thing that to follow on from that is I get like, oh my god, I stole the red. Oh, I didn't. I get a lot of questions about, like, you know, what do I do when, I don't know, like, my teammates, my side lanes are losing or whatever. You know, what do I do when my side lanes are, like, 0-10? And there's kind of a couple answers to that question. One is, like, you might just lose, honestly. You know, like, sometimes you just lose. You probably can win that game if you play really well. And you might be like, okay, well, Shok, you know, what does playing really well look like? And basically, it means, like, you don't actually need to play any different from how you're normally playing, right? You pretty much should just play the game by the same rules that you normally do, right? You know, like, or another example would be, like, I often get, like, what do I do, or how do I side lane when I'm behind? And, like, the reality is, like, the same rules still apply, it's just, like, the outcome's gonna be different. So, for example, a side lane rule that I like to use is I push out the side wave as far as I can without dying, okay? So, if my teammates are losing, I'm still going to try to push out the side lane as far as I can without dying. But, like, how far that is gonna be, like, potentially a little different, right? Because, like, in this case, like, maybe I don't have the vision, or, you know, my teammates aren't there. So, like, if you understand what your overall goal is, i.e., push out the side lane as far as you can without dying, you will kind of understand, like, what are the levers that lead to that. Like, you're not going to learn it instantly, okay? Like, you're not going to... I'm not going to say that I've never died on the side lane, especially while learning, but you'll kind of get an idea of, like, well, what are the kind of factors that matter for that? And again, it might be, like, jungle position, it might be your wards, it might be your flash, it could be the champs, you know, there could be all these different things. But again, like, coming back to kind of understanding, like, what you actually... like, want to have happen is, like, really, really important. Well, I'm going to chase this guy down. I think he's dead. Actually, maybe he's just too fast. Dude, the Twitch slow scales so hard. I think he's dead, no? Yeah, wow, that's crazy. Okay, I'm going to try and get the bot turret here. Anyway, where was I? I kind of can't remember. Oh, yeah, so I was just, like, talking generally about all these, like, ways to learn things. So one of the best ways to learn things faster... Oh, wow, that's crazy. I think I'm fine there. I can flash again. One of the best ways to learn things faster is simply to watch other people play. So, like, one of the ways I learned is I would just kind of, like, watch and kind of, like, play spot the difference. You know, like, so for me, I learned a lot of this game from Rookie, who's my favorite player ever. And, yeah, what about that? I would mostly just, like, watch his VODs, and I'd kind of pay attention. I'd always be thinking, like, why behind everything. So, for example, if he traded, like, why? You know, and it might be like, okay, he traded because the enemy used a cooldown. And then it's like, you know, now I know, like, okay, I need to, like, fish for trades when my opponent has used a cooldown. As opposed to, you know, like, you could make it super specific. Like, oh, I need to make sure to trade with Vladimir when he uses his Q in the Zoe matchup. Do you see what I mean? Like, that would be very specific and not something that's actually going to help you very much, because how often are you playing the Vlad versus Zoe matchup? You know, like, probably not that often. Even if you main one of those champions, like, it just probably doesn't actually happen that often. So, always trying to, like, I guess, like, generalize it as much as possible to, you know, make it impact, like, as many of your games as possible is really, really key. And you can, like, do this with, like, basically everything, by the way. Like, you can, you know, I'm always trying to think of, like, rules and guidelines and stuff like that, because it's just so much easier to have those things to follow to help protect you for, like, all these unique scenarios, rather than needing to, again, like, rote learn every specific situation. Obviously, there's some situations that you might encounter over and over, right? But, like, chances are that, again, these can either be made easier by having some sort of guideline, or, you know, you might just kind of, like, naturally get used to them, right? Like, funnily enough, when I was new to this game, I kind of thought I had, like, a learning deficiency. I'm not even kidding. Because there was so much to get good at, and I just, like, I don't know, I felt like I just, like, wasn't improving that fast. You know what I mean? But, like, it turned out that it was just, like, there's a lot of habits to build in this game, and then they get a lot easier. Like, for example, once trading becomes, like, more of a, more of a habit, you'll naturally have like more, what's the word, like mental stack or like brain capacity to focus on something else, you know, whether that's like tracking the jungler or whatever. And also, I guess I'm kind of like rambling a bit at this point, but there are definitely certain times in the game where it's like way more important to focus on certain things than others. A question I get all the time is like, how often do you look at the minimap? And it's like, well, you know, I kind of just like look at the minimap when I need to, right? Like, for example, I will like stare at the minimap when I'm like over pushed in mid. I will like look at the minimap on the common gank timers, like 240, 320, 340, you know, like these timers. So like before and after scuttle, after like the first clear and stuff like that, you know, like I'm kind of aware of the times where I need to pay more attention to that. In fact, there's a comment on the previous video that I made where it's like, you know, say the game is simple or whatever, but like here you are playing this like difficult matchup in Challenger and performing. I can't quite remember the comment. But it's like, yeah, I guess like I just have like a ton of habits built up. I have these like rules I can follow, so I don't need to think so much about like reinventing the game. Kill that guy. Oh my god, I suck. And yeah, like stuff like dying to ganks is a lot of the time very support ganks, I admit, are like a lot harder to avoid, but there's like a lot of ganks that are like relatively telegraphed. I guess like another thing that I often see is people kind of talking about like mechanics or whatever. They talk about how like, oh, I'm too old to like play League nowadays, you know. They'll say like, I'm in gold and I think I'm like pretty good, but my mechanics hold me back, whatever. And it's like, you watch these players and like a lot of the time it's like, well, could their mechanics be better? Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I'm not going to say that like mechanics don't go a long way, but ultimately it's like, well, if you forget to place your ward at like 330 or whatever, then it doesn't really matter your mechanics because, you know, now you're just going to die to the jungle gank. And dying to one jungle gank just like completely fucks the game. So, yeah. I've definitely gone off script a little bit here, and that was a really good game, by the way. Holy shit, I went 8-0. But basically, what I was trying to say is that the game is really difficult to learn because there are just so many things that can happen in this game, and a lot of them are like very hard to see how they lead to something later down the line. Like something as simple as forgetting to place a ward at 230 causes you to die, which means like you end up, your jungler gets double scuttled, and then like your jungler's down XP at the like Rift Herald fight, and suddenly you lose that important Rift Herald fight, right? Like all that sort of stuff adds up. And so that's kind of why like smurfs and stuff can win so many games, is because they're doing so many of these little things right. And that's, you know, that's snowballing in ways that you can't even see, right? Like there's a lot of invisible effects in this game. For example, like if you place a ward at level 1 and that spots out the enemy jungler, maybe that helps your bot lane live to a gank at 3 minutes, but you have no idea that that's what did it, right? So there's so many of those like little things all throughout the game that are making those things happen. And yeah, to I guess TLDR again, like how you want to deal with it. I think the best ways are to just focus on learning the fundamentals, focus on the biggest things first. Anything that's going to like impact the entire game, like I really recommend working on laning phase. I really recommend learning like warding, you know, team fighting, side lane macro, this stuff that's just going to happen all the time. I think that is incredibly important. So anyway, that's the end of this video. Let me know if there's other things you want me to talk about in the comments section. I have a few other ideas, but like obviously let me know. Yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.